Welcome to the Kent Lap Podcast.
It's funny when I tell people that I've lived here my whole life. They're like, "Oh, you're one of the few." So yeah, I've lived here. I mean, I grew up in Franklin, as I said. My children are 10th generation Williamson Countyans or Franklinites, and so
like not even Middle Tennessee, like Williamson County.
Yes.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, so I tell people, Franklin, downtown Franklin is always hopping, and it's, I don't know if cool's quite the right word, but it's happening. There's a lot going on.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And but when I was a kid, I was like tumbleweed going down Main Street. I mean, everything closed early. There was just a couple. I mean, it was just a lot of kind of old, kind of kitschy shops on Main Street. Not a lot of bars or food establishments or anything that kind of stuff. And so the town's really changed. But anyway, so my children are 10th generation, Williamson County. Going back, I think my family first moved here in the 1760s, so even pre-Revolutionary War.
Wow.
Fast forwarding a little bit, they had some money, they had means, they literally had plantations that are still in our county. I mean, just a few miles from where I live. At one point, I think it was 1841, my family was the largest slaveholding family in Williamson County. Over 240 slaves. And so it's something that, I talk with a lot of students, and when we teach African-American history, of course, a lot of people are like, well, my family didn't own slaves and I'm not racist and all that. Right. Well, I say, well, I can't say that.
Yeah.
My family did. And so that's part of our story. It's just really interesting. I mean, I can, when I was a kid, I lived with my grandparents for a good part of growing up for a couple different reasons. And I can remember, not that the Confederacy was like something that there wasn't a lot of like that tradition kind of stuff, but I remember they had like these framed pictures of Confederate money in one of their rooms, and they had a picture of the Battle of Franklin that had both sides,
Oh, okay.
And I knew that I had family members who were in the Confederacy, and it was weird. That's just this kind of, I don't know, the weird tension, I think, of race in the South for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I can remember my grandfather had construction business, and he had a lot of African Americans who worked for him, and I think was generally seen as they connected well, kind of cross culturally. But at the same time, I can remember him saying the N-word.
Your
as
grandfather?
a kid. Oh yeah. And so that's very, and I can remember my just other family members saying things like that, or talking about like where African Americans lived in Franklin, calling it Colored Town.
Wow, yeah.
So I can just remember those things. But then at the same time, my grandparents, they moved to Atlanta for about a 10-year period in my mom's growing up years. So she actually went to high school in Atlanta. My uncle, who's younger than her, went to the same school as Dr. King. I mean, Dr. King's children, sorry.
Oh, wow.
And my aunt, who is currently a state Supreme Court justice. That's a little humble brag there.
Yeah, there we go.
Nothing to do with me, but
that's cool. What's her name?
Her name is Justice Cornelia Clark, Connie Clark. So she's been on the. So anyway, but she was she went to the same high school, and she actually worked on Andrew Young's campaign, who was I think he was the second African American mayor of Atlanta, and he was one of the. I mean, he was with Dr. King in Memphis when he was shot. He was at Selma. I mean, he was a great civil rights leader, still alive today, actually, and helped get the Olympics to Atlanta. So, I guess I'm just trying to say that. So I have this, this tension in my family. So my aunt, who was, I would say somebody who was really active for civil rights. I'm talking 70s and 80s, and she was a lawyer, and yet then I have my grandfather who, used the N-word. My parents. I played sports when I was a kid, and as I said, went to public school, and it was very diverse in Franklin back in the day. So I would have friends who are African American come spend a night at my house, and I would go to their houses, and my parents never acted like that was weird. And as simple and as obvious as that might sound, I think that was a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Looking back on it, didn't think about it at the time. When I mentioned to you on the phone, and I don't know if I'm getting too long-winded here,
but you're good.
When I became a Christian in high school, I was 16, and right at the beginning of my junior year in high school, I got pretty early on connected to a guy named Scott Rowley, who was a pastor at Christ Community Church. And he was sort of a hippie-looking guy who was the youth leader, but he had a real heart for racial reconciliation.
Okay.
And so he would have these Bible studies where he would go into, parts of Franklin where there were all African Americans right in downtown, and he would have these Bible studies of mostly African American kids, few white kids, and I got involved in that, and we would play basketball, then study the Bible, and he was just, really intentional that way, and so that's in some ways my Christian. It kind of got into the DNA of my Christian experience and what it meant to be a Christian for me, and so. He was really important in my life, and then I mentioned Paige Pitts, who started New Hope, was discipled my wife, and they had a Franklin Community Ministries, which was out of Christ Community Church back when it was a downtown Franklin before the new building out Hillsborough Road. They were just really intentional about doing all these cross-racial ministries. And there was a tapestry group, which was getting together women of different races. And I mentioned, the Bible studies. I mean, New Hope Academy essentially came out of it. Strong Tower Bible Church, where Chris Williamson is still the pastor. He was an intern and worked closely with Scott and Paige, and he's African American, just to be clear to all the listeners. And so Strong Tower, which is a really intentionally racially diverse church, was started, and that. So all those things, my formative years, as a Christian, was in that environment.
Wow. Like in your late teens,
mid to
late teens.
Yeah. So and I know it doesn't look like it. I played college football, and and I was a wide receiver.
Okay.
And so I tell this to my class. There's not many times where white people living in Williamson County are in the minority, and so there was one year where all of my people in the receiver group and my head receiver coach were all African American.
Really?
And in college, you spend a lot of time with your group, whether it's offensive line, whatever position group. You watch tons of film. You have lots of meetings. There's lots of, lots of those things going on. So, so I was, for those moments, I was the minority.
Yeah.
And even in my other years playing, there was always more African American in the room, African Americans in the room, and so I don't know, just all these things play into it. I love history, and so I'm just constantly reading books about African American history. I've the new Jim Crow. I'm looking at that right now, and so that's where I'm spending a lot of time right now. I'm reading a book about when Dean Smith is a basketball coach at North Carolina, when he integrated the team, and how it was just this big ordeal in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in the 60s when Charlie Scott played basketball for North Carolina. I'm reading that for fun. So I guess that all plays into why African American history.